Latch the windows, lock the doors, and put the kids to bed. It's time for another episode of
Tales from the Garage!
Okay guys, here I am back before I forget where I left off with Terry Riley Part 3. I think Part 4 might be the last part. I guess, like I mentioned before, I only have what I would consider an overview of the types of works he's done and not a definitive discography. Anyway. I was attempting to do these parts in some kind of sensible order, but it didn't work out for various reasons. I could have done a timeline thing, but I thought I would kind of divide up solo albums with collaboration albums, and then things that Terry doesn't necessarily play on, but that he composed for other groups. So things kind of got skewed out of order. And I'm actually, I think in the previous videos, I kind of showed all the actual vinyl that I have, which was focused mainly on his, on Terry Riley's, pretty much his solo performances, where he plays all the instruments. And I didn't quite get finished with those. I didn't want the videos to go on for more than 16 hours, so I kind of cut it off before I was done with the solo releases. So here I am starting with one, probably his best known solo release apart from In C, but In C was something for an ensemble and not a solo performance by Riley. So I think this is 68 or 69 this was recorded in, and came after In C. And this, A Rainbow and Curved Air, which is the one that, this would be the one album that a lot of people who only have one album by Terry Riley might have this one. It's entirely Terry. It's one of his best things. It's like two 20-minute pieces, essentially. One for each what was vinyl side, and just Terry on organ, and then also more of a Rainbow and Curved Air was mainly the organ piece, and the second piece is Poppy, No Good, and the Phantom Band, which was primarily a lot more saxophone led. Terry playing the saxophone, and of course organ as well. This isn't in the Just Intonation, which came later, so it's easier on the ears. This is probably, along with the soundtrack I showed, which was actually my favorite Terry Riley thing, the soundtrack called Lifespan. The original title was in French, and that CD finally got reissued on CD. From that album in 2007, along with another soundtrack from also another 1970s soundtrack from a movie called Happy Endings. So that 2007 reissue was really probably the easiest, along with this thing, to get into Terry Riley. It's Terry Riley playing, primarily organ and soprano saxophones, that kind of thing, and pretty easy stuff to get into if you're going to get into him at all. So that reissue that I showed earlier, the soundtracks, which is still out there and in print, and this one are probably the best places to start and highly recommended. Now, I mentioned in recent years, there's a label. I can't figure out whether Terry owned it or who it was. I don't think it's around anymore, though I think the records are still in print, or the CDs anyway. For a few years, there was this label called Organ of Corti Records, Corti, and they did what they called the Terry Riley Archive series, and it was primarily, but not exclusively, things that hadn't been released before. Very early recordings of Terry's, mostly from the 1960s. Mostly they were fairly professionally recorded live performances. But as being a live performance, and especially from the 1960s, they are a bit more raw, not fiddled with so much in the studio after the fact, and probably mostly for collectors. So there was this one simply called Poppy No Good and the Phantom Band All Night Flight Volume 1. So it is a live performance of the second piece from this album, and that's all that's on here. It's a almost just under 40 minutes of what was a 20-minute piece on the Rainbow and Curved Air album is now a 40-minute live performance piece, primarily, like I said, for saxophone and that digital delay thing that Terry created so that he could play a part either on keyboards or saxophone or voice or whatever, and it could kind of overlap. It wasn't so much tape loops because the parts overlapped but faded away. But it's interesting if you like the Poppy No Good piece. It's much more saxophone-led piece than keyboards. In fact, most of the organ in it is basically almost like a bass function, like the bass notes on the organ, the lower end of the organ, are being played kind of as a bottom support to all the saxophone lines that are going on. To be honest, it's a bit much for 40 minutes of this one piece that was initially, just a 20-minute piece on the studio album, and obviously the studio album has better sound. And this particular recording is from Buffalo, New York, in March 22, 1968. And the concert was called All Night Flight and was probably one of Terry's very famous, at the times, all-night concerts where he would play for hours and hours and hours overnight throughout the whole night. And it was essentially expected that people would sit in the audience and fall asleep, kind of thing. They occasionally do these now. Not Terry, but sometimes there's I think that the music series that's in the Philadelphia area that Chuck Van Zyl runs maybe occasionally does one of those in their regular program, annual program. So moving on with yet another archive release from the Organ of Corti label. This was Organ of Corti number 2, whereas the previous one I showed was number 4. And it's called Reed Streams and In C. Now, this one is slightly different than the other Organ of Corti releases in that, I don't know, these all came out in the, I want to say the 2000s or the late 90s, probably more like the 2000s. They're not that old. And this one is slightly different, though it is, again, all older pieces, ranging from about 1966 to 1970. I'll read a little bit of the liner notes on this one. Reed Streams was actually Riley's debut record. So apparently sometime in 1966 or 67, this album came out, and probably went out of print really fast or was on a tiny label. So this one is not just a live performance thing, but the actually a reissue of a very early solo Terry Riley thing where he's actually playing the parts. An album called Reed Streams. And again, it says it's a good example of Riley's early music, early trance music. They labeled it as. Boy, these black CD booklets, man, they get your fingerprints on them really quickly. The FBI could have these fingerprints. So it was called an example of early trance music for keyboard and solo soprano saxophone. So that is Reed Streams, which was his very early solo album where Riley's playing the parts. And so there's another piece on here called Dorian Reeds, which again apparently is a very early piece for mainly soprano saxophone. Again, a little crude on the recording side. And it says that these recordings were actually unavailable since 1966, prior to them getting reissued on the CD. So I guess it probably came out on a really tiny label, and they did an initial run, and that was it. Again, another example of early Terry Riley, solo Terry Riley for the most part, but a little bit on the crudely recorded side, especially when you've got things that were recorded later, which are a bit more tweaked in the studio, or a little bit more sound quality to them. So this has those two pieces, Reed Streams and Dorian Reeds, an untitled organ piece. Again, a very early piece. And there is a recording from 1970 that's kind of, tagged on here in addition. This one is instead of just being a straight live recording, there's that first album of his, another untitled organ piece, which again is an early piece that is not bad, but it's not one of the things I'd send somebody running to that hadn't heard Riley. And there's also a performance of In C on here. This is not the original recording of it, from 1970. And listening again to this recently, I hate to say this, it strikes me as being the most god-awful performance you would probably ever hear of In C. And looking at the notes, I guess the intent, I don't think Riley actually had anything to do with this. If you know the history of In C, it's a piece made for various performers, and the range of performers, I forget what the number was like. It could be for anywhere from 18, I think it starts at, up to 55 performers. So the number of musicians involved is flexible, and each musician is given a certain number of parts or phrases to play, and they can repeat the phrase as frequently or infrequently as they desire, where they desire, pause where they desire, and then before going on to the next little section that they have to play, which again can be repeated once or 100 times or paused or whatever. So all the players overlap in different ways. It's quite interesting, and so no two performances of In C are going to be anywhere near the same, even by the same ensemble. The problem with the 1970 performance is, and I'm not really looking so much at the at who's playing on it. I don't even know if there's a listing in here. I have to go through the booklet. It was recorded in 1970, essentially as an electric psychedelic version, which is kind of hinted at. This might not be good. I don't know how many performers are. There's a whole bunch. There's probably at least 18, or whatever that minimal number is. But unfortunately, all the music is lost because there's a very loud bass player and drummer, electric bass, that is basically playing a very simplistic pretty much 4/4, and the bass is like dun 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 for the whole piece. So it's like a rock band version of it, but the bass and drums are, well, they root it too much. This is not a piece that should be rooted in rhythm as much as patterns. All the patterns have a rhythm, but the patterns kind of go in and out of sync, and you can tune into different parts of the patterns and focus on different instruments, which is the beauty of something like NC. It's not meant to have a rock band rhythm section playing around, and the rock band rhythm section is 10 times louder. At times, the bass and drums just drown out the rest of the instruments going on. You can't barely hear what the other instruments are doing. You certainly can't hear the different interweaving and overlapping of these phrases. And so I listened to this again recently, and the only thing that struck me was, how this has got to be the worst ever performance of NC. And I don't recall it. The strange thing is I don't recall when I played it earlier it hitting me like that. Maybe I was daydreaming or something in the when I got this CD a number of years ago. But man, it's not. Whew, wow, stinky. So I think that almost it leads is the end essentially of the strictly solo albums, even though the piece in C isn't a solo piece. And I'm going to move on a little bit to some collaborative things, and then leave off the larger works written for other performers, maybe for the next video. Here's a good one that I was glad I bought at the time. I bought it in must have been '85. I bought it. I remember very early in the CD era, and I believe this was a soundtrack to a movie. It was recorded in November 1984, a studio recording of, and it's, I don't know if you want to call it a collaboration, because Terry did write all the music on it, but it's a duo album with Terry Riley playing the Prophet 5 synthesizer, piano, and vocals, and Krishna Bhatt, B-H-A-T-T, on sitar and tabla. So it's a two-man improvisation thing. It's called No Man's Land. This is the original version of it. And because it was on this label that I think is long gone, a small label called Planis Fair. And I remember buying it, and a few years later, it being nearly impossible to get a hold of. And I was glad that I bought it when I did, only for it to get reissued in recent years. And when they reissued it, they've got like 22, 27 minutes more of music on it, and it's like, damn, maybe I should have waited. So they re-released this. The original album's about 42 minutes, and when they released it, they just tagged on a whole bunch of music that I don't have and I haven't heard, so I don't know. I don't think it's necessarily from the same sessions, but it could be. And I don't know the additional music on the new version, whether it includes Krishna Bhatt or whether it is just Terry Riley. That information isn't, not available to me. But I think the material. I'm not even sure if the material was recorded at the same time, probably. But I like this. I like duo albums anyway. Studio recording. This is another one that I would recommend. It's not it's not one of the difficult things. It's not one of the things in just intonation. For the most part, I don't know. There might be a track or two where I start to hear a little bit of just intonation creeping in, but it could be just the way Terry's doing the scales for those pieces. Supposedly, this is for I can't find the information on it now. I thought it was for some kind of soundtrack. I'm going to pull out the booklet and try. Yeah, it's some kind of, but I don't know that it's necessarily a movie as much as it could be more of a documentary type of thing, or even a historical thing. But it's 42 minutes of goodness. You've got the sitar and tabla in there, no strain. Terry studied Indian music, and a lot of his own music, even when he's playing only instrumental parts himself, have a heavy influence of East Indian music anyway. So it's not surprising to hear him doing a recording, which is the one I've chosen to play in the background. I don't know how much you'd be able to hear it. It's not unusual to hear Terry doing a recording then with somebody, that's an East Indian musician. Nice album, a lot of piano and sitar, piano and tabla, some organ on this. But it's a nice album. There's shorter, bite-sized pieces in here. The longest piece is about 8.5 minutes, and there's pieces 3 minutes long or so. Nice album though. Highly recommended. Now that it's back in print, pretty easily available. There's another, I can't pronounce this guy's name, but there's another collaborator who's apparently an Italian bass player, upright bassist, who I believe is a composer himself. And I'm not sure, but I believe I had read that he was, for a time anyway, also a music teacher, possibly here in the United States. At I don't know if it was Mills College, but it was one of the places where Terry has also been a teacher for some time. And I believe that's where they met. And so this upright bassist, whose name is Stefano, this is the hard part, Scodinibio or Scodinibo, recorded a couple things with him. And I thought that'd be an interesting combination. To hear Terry and an upright bassist as being the only two musicians. So Stefano and Terry's playing synthesizer and voice, no piano on this one, and Stefano is just playing the upright bass. This is a strange sounding recording, and this I didn't realize they were live recordings, but it makes sense now because I didn't hear a whole lot of overdubbing or studio things going on in here. In fact, you would think that the synthesizer of Riley would be obviously the lead instrument, but there's a lot of very quiet, very avant-garde sections where you hear Stefano basically bowing the bass. And the way it's recorded, I think intentionally so, even though these are all live recordings from 1998, 1999, and 2000. So this is basically 3 pieces on the longish side, a total of 54 minutes. But Stefano is more the lead instrument here, and the recording of it's a little weird at first. And I was thinking, I don't know if this is intentionally recorded this way, but I think it was. It very much sounds like Stefano is all the way in the back of a very reverberant hallway bowing the bass. Because instead of having that close-up sound, where you're very aware that this is a bowed bass, it sounds very distant, very much in a reverberating hallway, and almost electronic in a way until you really hone in on it. If you're paying close attention, you realize it is a bass, because the bass is not treated or processed with any electronics. And the weird thing is the bass is very much up front for long periods of time, and if the keyboards are there at all, they're very much in the background. And because Terry's using synthesizer here, and this is definitely from a period when he was doing recordings with that just intonation thing. I think this might be one of those just intonation things. This is I like this album, but it's difficult, and you have to be in the mood for it. And this is a rare one that's actually recorded for the German Wergo label. I love this label. The recordings here in the U.S. of Wergo have been getting harder and harder to find. The distribution isn't what it used to be, I think, in the U.S., and they're starting to get, when you find them, they're starting to get a little more costly than they used to be. I love this label. I hope they're not having any difficulties in terms of keeping afloat, because they make ECM Records look like a pop music label. I don't know of anything I've ever heard on Wergo that had any potential to even reach like a new age, like a 1980s new age label, where maybe some of the 1980s new age music may have skirted, like a George Winston or somebody like that, may have skirted along the area of being popular in a mass way. Maybe not in a million selling rock or rap kind of way, but selling a lot of copies of an album. Wergo is pretty much all nothing but avant-garde music. I got to give this label major props for being able to stay in business as long as they have without going a more commercial route. I don't know how they do it. I hope their U.S. distribution gets a little bit better. But this is I really enjoy this, but I do have to be in the mood for it, because there's times when I'll put on a Terry Riley playlist and this is in there, and I just throw it in there, and I'm not feeling it at that particular moment. Now Stefano was much younger than Riley, and I didn't pull up his info here, but I read he actually passed away in recent years, which was surprising because he's, I want to say, at least 20 years younger than Riley. So I don't know what happened. I believe he went back to Italy. He wasn't in the U.S. anymore at the point when he passed away. This one I think is one of those ones that are hard to get now in the U.S. And like I said, this is all live recordings. Terry did another one with Stefano called Lazy Afternoon Among the Crocodiles. And this one, though, is a studio recording from October 94 and January 95. Again, like the other album, it's got 3 pieces, but this is a studio recording. But it's pretty much the same setup. Stefano's playing just the upright bass, and Terry's sticking to just synthesizers. I think this one, being a studio recording, a little bit more clear, maybe slightly less avant-garde. This is pretty far out there. It's an unusual recording, though. There's only 3 pieces on here, and it's only about 27 minutes long. Strangely enough, because this isn't on Wergo, it's on some other label. It looks like a French label. But I saw that I was surprised when I looked this up recently, because I bought this when it came out, to see that this one is still in print, but it's only 27 minutes, and you're basically paying for the pricing anyway, is essentially priced at a full CD. But in terms of the music, I think, maybe it's because it's a studio recording with slightly better sound. I listened to it recently, but kind of memory escapes me. I think there's a bit more Terry's keyboards on this one. So I tend to maybe go to this one first. But the title's one of those oddball titles, Lazy Afternoon Among the Crocodiles. So, I've gone on for almost a half hour. And what I've got left now is mostly larger scale recordings, or recordings where Riley wrote them for other ensembles, doesn't necessarily play on them himself. And I'll do that in the fourth part, which will be probably the last part for this. So I hope everybody's enjoying this Marathon Riley thing I'm doing. And remember what I said in the early video. It's Terry Riley's world. We're just living in it. And I'll see you all soon. Digging the music.
Tune in next time for more
Tales from the Garage.